Fessenden was notoriously bad at getting publicity. And back in those days, and when I'm talking those days, I'm talking turn of the 20th century, 1900, 1901, 1902, that era. Marconi was a master of getting publicity. He knew how to get everybody writing about him. Now, there's a big debate, and I'm sure you've read it, about whether it was Marconi or Tesla who was the first to really transmit across the ocean. I don't care. What I care about is how the story got told. Marconi absolutely contributed to what became wireless telegraphy. Fessenden, wireless telephony. God bless them both. I truly wish Mr. Fessenden had been a nicer person. By all accounts, he kind of wasn't. He was kind of cranky, okay? And he was really angry about the fact that he didn't get his share of publicity. And when he was ill, his wife and his son created the story of the Christmas Eve broadcast 1906. Because you see, we have his writings, and he never mentioned it. His wife and his son did years later. But the truth is, Reginald Fessenden absolutely was the first to send voice and music over the wireless, and he proved that it could be done. But if we're going to talk about somebody who sent out what we would know today as radio broadcasts, these guys, this is Charles Doc Harold with his then wife, Sybil. They later divorced. But from about 1910 through 1914, and even later, okay, they had a radio station at the Herald College of Wireless. Yes, that was a thing. In San Jose, California. And once a week, sometimes twice a week, they sent out voice and music. They were way ahead of their time. They took requests. Amateurs, who were the people that were really listening, amateurs would send in requests by telegram. Sybil would play them. So Doc kind of did the engineering. Sybil was quite the Morse code expert. She was said to have a really good fist. I mean, she could send Morse code beautifully. But she also was a very good announcer. And by many accounts, she was the first woman to send out voice and music. And she did. 1912 through 1914, and it was written about in the newspapers. It is well documented. But what about the first radio station, Donna? Nope, it wasn't KDKA in Pittsburgh. We're coming up on another anniversary, which means another year's worth of KDKA claiming they were the first station. They weren't. They were the third. But boy, howdy, did they have a publicity department. And what we have here is a rare photograph of the station that was the first radio station. It was on the air in August of 1920 under the call letters of 8MK. And I'm sure you know your region, so you know that 8 is Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, okay? And what you see here is Howard Trumbo, he's on my left, Elton Plant, he's in the center, and Frank Edwards, he's on the right with the headphones. I'm going to tell you more about this picture because it says a lot about early radio. Early radio had to have an engineer in the studio, and the engineer was always an amateur radio broadcaster, because in many cases, the early stations are using amateur calls. 8MK relied upon a local record shop to give them the shellac that they used, and they relied upon an engineer. Much more will be said about this, but we know for a fact that 8MK was on the air in the summer of 1920. Voice and music, election returns, they did stuff long before KDKA, and we have lots of documentation of this as well. Here's the Detroit News headline, September 1st, 1920. Land and water here returns by wireless. Oh, by the way, nobody is calling it radio back in those days. They're calling it either the wireless telephone, the radio phone, or just the wireless. And the Detroit News, the first newspaper to own and operate a radio station, they put it on the air. But here's what irritates me and why I'm glad I'm talking to you today. See this guy, the guy sitting at the table here? It wouldn't have happened without him. Clyde Eldon Darr. He was a long-time amateur. He was originally 8CB. He later got a land station. He was 8ZZ. And it was his experiments that led to the first radio station. His reward for this? Completely written out of the story. Not even mentioned in the story of WWJ, which is still on the air. 8MK, we have lots of documentation of what they did. They mentioned that their first broadcasts were at his house. He did the experiments in voice and music. I want to make sure he's remembered because it would not have happened that we had that first radio station without this amateur. And that story will repeat itself in place after place after place. And I'm going to get to Albuquerque in a second, and you'll see it repeating itself there too. But let me say something else about why you needed an engineer in the studio in early radio. Here we have one of my favorite historical pictures. This is WBZ in Boston, still on the air. Back then it was in Springfield, Massachusetts, at the Westinghouse plant. And unfortunately, the first studios were often at the plants where the manufacturers were making the radios. So here you have a pianist and a singer, and they're doing their broadcast around workbenches with tubes and wires. And there's a big sign up, you can't see it. Electricity, be careful. Not exactly aesthetic and kind of dangerous, to be honest with you. Notice the engineer. That's Horace R. Dyson, Harry Dyson, 1 AUV. He was a boy amateur. And if he looks nervous, he's nervous because he's worried that somebody is going to come up against one of those wires or one of those tubes. There are a whole bunch of stories of the early studios and the early studios being at the plants where the things are made, and early singers really climbing up ladders to get there. Later, studios are going to be in hotels where it's a lot safer. But in the early days, you can't have a broadcast without an amateur radio operator who knew engineering, who could fix something if it broke, who knew how to keep people safe, who understood Morse code and who understood repairing equipment. Harry Dyson was one of those engineers. By the way, some of the early people in ham radio were women. This is Cecile Powell, 1WX. She was the assistant to Hiram P. Maxim, the founder of the ARRL. She was the first woman in the state of Connecticut to have a radio set. She did her own engineering. She trained other engineers. She trained women during the war to join the Signal Corps. She was quite famous in her day, and she was not the only one. More will be said about this. But let's go to New Mexico, if we may, and let's talk about somebody who doesn't get talked about enough. Louis Falcone. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with him. Some of you may have even known him. He died in 1948. But there was a time when 5ZA was the most widely known amateur call in New Mexico. It was heard everywhere. Louis Falcone's an interesting guy. He was an electrician, and like many people back then in the 19-teens, he fell in love with ham radio. And he became a devoted amateur. And by the way, the term ham radio isn't in common use either. In fact, calling somebody a ham is still an insult. If you read old issues of QST, speaking of which, the best thing that ever happened to my life as a researcher was the fact that some of the early editions of radio magazines can be found on what used to be called AmericanRadioHistory.com. Today it's WorldRadioHistory.com. I cannot say enough good things about it. David Gleason is a wonderful person. And when you go on WorldRadioHistory.com, you can read early editions of all kinds of amateur magazines and commercial magazines from the founding years of radio. And that's how I found out more about Louis Falcone. So he was born in Italy. He was raised in Virginia. And he came to Roswell, New Mexico around 1917. And there's a real question about whether he was the first amateur in New Mexico with influence. Because while there may very well have been other amateurs in New Mexico, he became an officer in the ARRL. He became the division director for New Mexico. Many of the amateurs of that era knew him, worked with him, and were very impressed with what he was up to. And what I was impressed by is his wife, Eunice, was also an amateur. And the two of them worked on 5ZA, which later, of course, became W5ZA. And he was so beloved that when he died in 1948, the FCC issued a waiver to let his wife take up W5ZA and keep it going under those call letters because they were such famous call letters back then. Now, some people say that this guy, Ralph Willis Goddard, the Dean of Engineering at what was then called New Mexico College of Agricultural and Mechanical Arts, some people say that he was the first broadcaster in New Mexico. But I'm telling you, I think you could make a good case for Louis Falcone because he was doing what he was doing in 1919. The earliest I can find Goddard is 1920. And if I'm wrong, I'll admit it, okay? The bottom line is Falcone does not seem to have gotten involved with commercial radio, but he certainly taught an awful lot of amateurs in New Mexico, and he certainly apprenticed them into ham radio. But Mr. Goddard, who was the Dean of Engineering at what became New Mexico State, he did groundbreaking work that did lead to commercial broadcasting in New Mexico, okay? He was the advisor of the radio club at New Mexico State. It was 5CX. They were around from about 1921 on. Their first president was a student named Earl F. Kiernan. Now, I know what you're thinking. So what, Donna? Yeah, but very large so what? Because Ralph Goddard saw the future, and he knew that voice and music was going to happen, and he knew that commercial radio was going to happen. And so he got a land station, 5XD. And what he and Earl Kiernan did, and I've got documentation of this, is they traveled all over New Mexico all over New Mexico. By the way, if you've got your mic on, if you possibly could mute it, it would help me out a lot because I'm competing with other people's conversations. Thank you. I appreciate that. I hope I'm not being boring. I don't want to be boring. So Ralph Goddard traveled all over the state of New Mexico with Earl Kiernan, his student, and they made it to Albuquerque in February of 1922. And they gave demonstrations at a couple of schools, at high schools, at middle schools, what were then called junior high schools. And they taught kids about, hey, you too can be an amateur and maybe you can be a commercial broadcaster. Who knows? So what later happens, as I'm sure you're aware, is that Goddard basically becomes the founder of a commercial station called KOB. KKOB these days. In fact, let's do fun facts. So Louis Falcone, we got him in 1919, running the New Mexico division of the ARRL. Then we've got several colleges that are experimenting with radio. We got of course, the Aggies, the New Mexico College of Agricultural and Mechanical Arts. We just discussed 5CX, 5XD, but also there's another school doing it as well. The University of New Mexico has an Albuquerque branch. They have 5YQ. They're on the air in March of 1922, and they become KFLR in 1923. Now, by the end of the 20s, they're gone, but they still were broadcasting. Now, here's what I also find interesting. Let's say hello to the Albuquerque Radio Club. I'm sure you're aware of them. They're your ancestor. I love people's ancestors. I've got them operating beginning in mid-March of 1922. The club met on Monday nights at the office of the Albuquerque Evening Herald newspaper, which promoted their events. The first officers of the Albuquerque Radio Club were Bert Noe, who was a local telegrapher. He was also an engineer. He installed radio sets all around Albuquerque, and I've found all kinds of articles about him. In fact, he installed a radio set at the YMCA and taught radio courses there. By the way, that's something that Goddard did as well. He taught radio courses during the war. He taught them for the military, for the Signal Corps. He taught them later on for anybody that wanted to learn about them. But they were also operating, doing radio courses through the Albuquerque Radio Club. Their club secretary was Harvey W. Smith. He was 5CV. He was a student. So was Charles K. Rice, 5UI. Now, remember I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned Harry Dyson. There were a whole bunch of what was called boy engineers and some girl engineers. Boy engineers were young teenagers who became fascinated by radio broadcasting and who became so interested in it that they decided to go into it professionally. Let me just show you my mother. I mean, she's not my real mother, but she's my spiritual mother. This is a girl engineer. This is Eunice Randall. Eunice is 19 years old when this picture is taken. She is the first woman radio announcer in Massachusetts, one of the first in the East. She's won CDP, and she's on the air at radio station 1XE, Greater Boston's first radio station. So this is a great time to be a teenager because a lot of young men and women are fascinated by amateur radio, and they later take that to commercial radio. So hats off to the Albuquerque Radio Club. I've always wondered what happened to it. You could probably tell me more, but I do like to see origin stories, and I love it when I find out what happened to people. And I've got a lot of information about some of these early folks. Charles Rice goes on to become, for example, a merchant, and he has his own radio shop. Remember I mentioned to you earlier, in fact, the first slide I showed you. WRES, the Wollaston Radio Electric Shop. There were two ways to get call letters back in those days. You could take what the government gave you, which was usually in sequential order. The government just kind of handed them out. Or you could request them. WRES was a requested call because it was a radio shop. Now, a radio shop was a meeting place in the early 1920s. Everybody who was anybody hung out at the radio shop. You could buy components, you could buy parts, you could see the latest in receivers, you could see the latest tubes, you could see the latest everything. And there was an engineer on duty, usually an amateur, who could show you how to use this great stuff. And that's why some of the early stations got started at electric shops, because why wouldn't you? Oh, I got to say something about requested call letters. Back in the early days, remember I showed you the wonderful picture of WBZ, which, you know, featuring that engineer looking quite terrified. WBZ was not a requested call. WBZ, like I said, you got your call letters from the government back in those days. There is no FCC, as I'm sure you know, in 1920, 1921, 1922. The agency that supervises radio is the Department of Commerce. And they also supervise trees and fish and a whole bunch of other stuff. And Herbert Hoover, remember him? Herbert Hoover, he's going to go on to be president. But nobody knows that back then. In those early days, he's running the Department of Commerce. He's vehemently opposed to advertising. He wants commercial radio to be nonprofit, non-commercial. Needless to say, the owners are going to take a really dim view of this. It's like, hey, pal, you pay my bills, okay? I mean, like, if I'm non-commercial, how do I make any money? How do I pay for electricity, telephone, long lines? Gradually, radio is going to get commercial. And I mean commercials. But at first, they're not allowed to be. And the Department of Commerce hands out call letters. Where do they get them from? Ships at sea. In 1912, the Radio Act happened after the Titanic disaster. And it became a law that all ships at sea had to have a radio station and an awake operator. It had been voluntary before, but now it was mandatory. And you had to have somebody on board who was awake, who could send out like iceberg dead ahead, like signals. Didn't happen during the Titanic. It was still voluntary. Don't tell anyone, but the ship sank. The truth is that once radio stations needed to be aboard ships, they were given call letters. And the call letters were not so much for like, hey, we play the hits. It was all pretty much Morse code, weather reports. You know, if somebody on the ship was ill, you could message on shore. There was a doctor on the shore who could possibly give advice, that kind of thing. But what happened if one of those ships sunk? Or if one of those ships ran aground? The next ship did not want those call letters because they were perceived as bad luck. So the government has this stockpile of call letters. And when commercial radio came along, they got handed out to the commercial stations. So WBZ had been a ship, a West Coast ship, I do believe, and it ran aground somewhere along the line. And WBZ probably didn't know that. They were like, hey, whatever. Oh, by the way, you've probably heard that KDKA was the first commercial station. Nope. Not only was it not the first station on the air, It was not the first station to get a commercial license, which was not a thing until 1921, and WBZ got the first one. But I digress. So you could request call letters, or you could just take what the government gave you. Some people requested them. Some stations requested them. But by and large, you took what you got. In Boston, like I said, most of the call letters were just assigned by the government. Interestingly enough, though, in Illinois, for some reason, there were a couple of stations that had requested call letters and that are still around. WGN in Chicago was originally owned by the Chicago Tribune. Their slogan, world's greatest newspaper, WGN. They requested those calls, they got them. WLS in Chicago. Some of you may have grown up doing something that I did as a kid, broadcast band DXing. Ever do any broadcast band DXing? Where you kind of listen for distant stations and they come in at night, boom, AM radio. So WLS in Chicago was a top 40 station. WLS in Chicago. Donna, don't sing. But the truth is, WLS stood for World's Largest Store. They were owned by Sears Roebuck, which is a very big department store back in those days. Today, just about defunct. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of stations with origin stories like that. But anyway, back to radio out here. And in Albuquerque, like I said, it's fascinating to me that it's at the college level that so many of the experiments are happening. Same in Massachusetts. Here we have the home of Greater Boston's first radio station, 1XE, where Eunice Randall worked. 1XE was on the campus of Tufts College, still around, it's a university today, but Tufts College gave the world some of the first broadcasters in Massachusetts. Usually it was the engineering departments that were doing the research and doing the work, and very often, like I said, it all started at ham radio clubs. Some of the amateurs decided they wanted to go into commercial radio. Some of the amateurs decided, hey, this was fun, but I had my experiments. I helped with the engineering at a commercial station. Now I'm going back to ham radio. And some did a little bit of both. Let me show you somebody, if I may. You may or may not be familiar with him. This is a rare photo of the late, great Irving Vermilya, 1ZE, later W1ZE. Irving in this picture is in his 50s. But when he was a young man, he was the New England director for the ARRL, and he was also the Elmer for Eunice Randall. He helped get her into amateur radio. Can I tell you a story, if I might? You may have worked Eunice. You may have worked either Eunice or Irving. Irving liked to claim that he was the first licensed amateur in the United States. And I like to claim that I'm the Queen of France. But the fact remains, he was certainly one of the earliest licensed amateurs after 1912. We have evidence that he knew Marconi, okay? Irving Vermilya was a legendary ham radio operator, okay? He went all over the country, kind of like Ralph Goddard did, just teaching about ham radio everywhere he went. If you just Google Irving Vermilya, go into any newspaper database, you will find hundreds of stories of Irving teaching ham radio, talking about ham radio, running ham radio clubs. But Irving also is the founder of a radio station that is still around, WNBH in New Bedford, and those are requested calls. New Bedford Hotel, WNBH. Many, many early stations got their start in hotels. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'll go back to it in a second and ask you a question. Why do you think so many early radio stations got their starts in hotels? Why were some of the first radio studios in hotels? Anybody got a hot guess?
Place for a live band in the ballroom. I'm sorry.
Yeah, for the
No.
music. For the
Oh,
music.
God bless you. Absolutely.
Antennas on
Sorry.
top of the roof.
Oh, yeah. For one thing, you could
Yeah.
put your antenna on top of the roof and nobody bothered you. But for another thing, as Charles said, and he was right, back in those early days, all radio is live. And if a guest doesn't show up, you are, as they say in French, in trouble. Okay? And as a result of needing live performers, it was a well-known thing that if you wanted to be an announcer in radio's early days, you had to do more than announce. Eunice sang if a guest didn't show up. Okay? I mean, she was a church singer. She sang in the choir. But if a guest didn't show up, you were expected to start singing. Okay? So in those early days, radio relied on live talent. If you're at a hotel, you got live talent because every single major hotel had an orchestra. And that orchestra could be pressed into service very quickly. Oh, I got to show you something. You, as amateurs, you'll get a kick out of this. This is another example of why we desperately needed amateurs back in the old days, okay? Because commercial stations couldn't set up remotes without them. Broadcast engineering isn't a thing yet because broadcasting is like 2 years old. So who knows how to set up stuff? Amateurs. And here we have a picture of something called a portable. Back in those early years, not every city had a radio station. So some big companies, like in this case, Edison, they put a radio station in a truck. They'd drive the truck out to an event. A couple of the amateurs would set it up, and then the announcers would do their thing. The two guys over next to the truck are the announcers. The two guys standing out on the ground there, they are the engineers, and one of them is Clarence V. Purcell, 1 MP, an active member of ARRL, and we could not have done early radio without him. But let me get back to Irving Vermilye. And before I do, I just want to share a rare piece of memorabilia, because I mentioned that when I was a kid growing up, DXing was a big hobby and I loved to do it. And I would hear stations from all over everywhere. In the 20s, you didn't get QSL cards from radio stations. You got Echo Stamps, which was a company. And you would have a stamp book and you would try to fill up your book. And if you got all of the stations from a particular state or all of the stations from a particular region, you could win prizes. There were a number of radio magazines that played a game called Radio Golf. And the goal was to hear the most distant stations, kind of like the old worked all states, worked all countries, you know, that kind of thing. And so you would try to hear the most distant stations that you could. You'd right away, they'd send you an echo stamp. You'd put it in your album, bada bing, bada boom. One other thing you did back in those early days, when you wanted to let people know you liked a station or you liked a program, you'd send away for applause cards. And then you would remark upon what show you liked. You'd send the applause cards to the station. And a lot of announcers use those applause cards to ask for raises. Hey, look at all the applause cards I'm getting. Ah, the good old days. But here's a story. And I don't mean to close on a down note, but I want to leave time for questions. I hope I'm doing okay. I hope I'm interesting. I hope I'm not boring you to tears. But let me tell you why you guys and ladies are so important. You are bringing people together out of love of ham radio. You are bringing people together to keep the hobby alive and to keep the history alive. The fact that you've had me come in and talk with you is an opportunity for me to give some credit to some of the amateurs who really helped to create commercial radio. And commercial radio becomes such a big deal because of you. But then times change. And people start forgetting the origin stories. And people like Louis Falcone are not talked about as much. And people like Ralph Goddard are not talked about as much. And the Albuquerque Radio Club and so many other local radio clubs that were the home to important amateurs who went on to start commercial stations or work at them, not talked about as much. Irving Vermilya spends years in amateur radio. He also spends years running WNBH in New Bedford, Massachusetts, about 80 miles from Boston. And then the industry changes. The station is bought up, and Irving is pushed out. The ham radio clubs that he belonged to, a lot of the clubs, the younger members want to take the club in a different direction. In the end, he's pushed out. He's at home. He feels alone. He feels like nobody cares about the 4 decades that he contributed to commercial radio and to amateur radio. And one night, feeling completely forgotten about, he killed himself. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you, if you know older hams that used to belong to your club, if you know older hams that used to be active, get in touch, send a card, let them know they're not forgotten. I wish I had known Irving, because I would have said to him, thank you. You were the mentor to Eunice Randall, the first woman radio announcer. And I spend my life telling the stories of people who have been forgotten. And I will not let you be forgotten, sir. I won't. And I don't. And I make sure wherever I go that the founders of my profession are remembered. Because radio is my life. And ham radio, amateur radio, is where commercial radio began. It was so important in the culture. It is still important in the culture. You are still important in the culture. Thank you for letting me come in and talk to you. May every year be a radio year. May every year be a year to share ham radio with people. I love you. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Honesty.
Donna, that was absolutely fantastic presentation. I can't thank you enough for
Did I do
sharing
okay?
that with
Was
us.
I all right?
I absolutely love history and history of radio. You know, I love that. And thanks to Jerry Jurens for recommending your presentation. So with that, I will allow, if anybody has questions for you, to come forward now.
But let me ask you guys first. I would assume you know more about the Albuquerque Radio Club than I do. Would that be a correct assumption or not? Yeah, see, that's my point, okay? Because I'm from away, I didn't want to like reinvent the wheel. But on the other hand, what I've found in city after city when I do these presentations is people often don't realize that they have ancestors, that there were radio clubs that came before them. And I just wanted to make sure that some of those people, if you already knew about them, terrific. If you didn't, now you know. And maybe there's some more stories of some more forgotten amateurs. I'll tell you a very quick story that may speak to some of you. I'll say 2 words: Bernie Aegis. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I found a photograph at a flea market. And it was a photograph of Bernie Aegis. I'd never heard of the guy, Eyges. But it was in a bunch of photos of 1XE, the first radio station, the one where all the amateurs worked, and I was trying to research the station. And it turned out that Bernie was one of their performers. He had dabbled in ham radio, but mostly he was a performer. And I got this great picture of him. And what does every media historian want to know when they get a great photo? This person got any living relatives? Because I wonder if they've seen this photo. I found out that Bernie had a grandson, and I was able to reach out to him, and his grandson had no idea that Bernie had been a band leader. The Bernie that he knew was a famous lawyer. And it turned out that Bernie used being a band leader to work his way through law school. So here I had this great photograph, and there was a backstory. Just like there's a backstory for Louis Falcone, just like there's a backstory for Ralph W. Goddard, just like there's a backstory for so many early amateurs. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am to share those stories. I hope I wasn't boring. I really hope I wasn't. But this is just so important to me that we thank these people. And if you know of any others from those early days, terrific. And maybe now you can write some of your own history and trace it back to March 18th of 1922. Albuquerque Radio Club first met.
May I ask a question?
No, I charge extra.
Hi, Donna. Wonderful talk. I used to work for KOB here in Albuquerque, and when I went down to New Mexico State, ran into KOBE and heard an interesting story about how there was a KOB in Albuquerque actually came from KOBE in Las Cruces. And I was curious if you ran across that and if you could say a few words about that.
Now, keep in mind, I haven't been to Albuquerque in years, but if I know my 1920s, we're talking probably like what, 3 to 4 hours to get from Las Cruces to Albuquerque. Am I right, or am I completely wrong?
No, you're correct. It's about 250 miles.
We're not talking like a quick jaunt in the 1920s, okay?
Probably a train.
Yeah, the fact that it got started as a land station, 5XD, and that it then ultimately got commercial call letters is not surprising. The fact that there's a story about several commercial call letters, maybe. But the one that I know of that was assigned first was KOB. And I have like the date when it was licensed and all this other stuff. But Goddard and the folks at the radio club in Las Cruces, they were doing these experiments in radio broadcasting and wireless telegraphy and then wireless telephony through the engineering department out in Las Cruces. And then they took it on the road and brought it all over the state. So there may very well have been offshoots in the early 20s, but they were unauthorized, okay? The only station that got the license that I know of was KOB.
So the other interesting story is in Albuquerque, and this isn't radio, this is more TV, but KGGM used to be a traveling van. From what I understand, in the Albuquerque area. Well, not in the Albuquerque area. They finally settled down in Albuquerque, and they are now.
They had to.
Yeah.
The FRC, the Federal Radio Commission, gets created in 1927. Remember that photo I showed you of the portable?
Mhm.
There were portables all over the state, all over every state. And the commercial broadcasters hated them.
Mhm.
Reason being, they would set up shop at a county fair or somewhere else, put up a big antenna, and boom, interference all over the place. And they lobbied, the commercial broadcasters lobbied the Federal Radio Commission. And in 1928, the Federal Radio Commission said to the portables, find a place, locate, stay there, or you're done. And a whole bunch of broadcasters ended up being done because they couldn't find a place to locate. But there's a multitude of stations, including in Oklahoma and various others. There was a guy named Charles Carroll, Carrell, and he owned 8 portables. He finally located one of them in Ponca City, and there it stayed. But as far as all the others, told to either pick a place or leave the air in 1928.
Thank you.
Anything else I can tell you? If I don't know
I
the
just-
answer, I'll make it up.
I just want to say, I wish I had a stack of applause cards that I could send you.
Did I do you okay, Jerry? I mean, I know you're the one that wanted me to come in. These nice folks don't know me from a hole in the ground, but I hope I did okay for you.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure. I was hoping that one of the fellows that was here, I don't remember who exactly it was,
Dave
but
have another
somebody.
question? I think Dave
Yeah.
had another question. Maybe.
Oh,
No,
Well, I
I
was
was
just gonna
just
say,
And
that
Dave
was
or
a
not?
clapping. That was a
Okay.
clapping. Anyway, sorry.
Oh, okay. I won't make any puns about the clap. I won't. So
I was just going to say that one of the fellows in the club a couple of months ago gave a talk on broadcast DXing in modern times, I guess. And it was so nice to see that linkage back to the early days. That's very cool. Thank you.
some of my earliest childhood memories was listening to the baseball game on WBAL in Baltimore. I was in Boston. I could get WBAL like great gangbusters late at night. And it was kind of fun to listen to. And some of those other states, that's how I traveled. I was just a working class kid. My family wasn't going to go much of anywhere. But thanks to radio, and I was a member of the Ham Radio Club in college, W1KBN, Whiskey 1, Kilo Bravo November. And yeah, I was, at some point when I have time, I would really like to get my ham calls again because it's been a long time since I've had them. But on the other hand, at least I can tell the story of many of the pioneering hams. And I do hope that I've told you some stories that you didn't know about. Oh yeah, I used to get WOWO in Fort Wayne all the time. Yes, absolutely. I remember it well. So anything else that I can tell you?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yes.
Yeah, when I was in middle school, you took me back a little bit because I'm from Chicago. I was born and raised there. And I remember going to WGN and all that kind of stuff. One of the other stations was WCFL in Chicago. They're still there. And they were started by the Chicago Federation of Labor,
Yes.
one of the labor
Yes.
unions.
Yes.
And I believe, and I was hoping maybe you could talk about some of these early stations of being able to commercialize it by using sports and everything, because apparently that was a huge thing, like in the 30s and the 40s, and right after World War II.
See, that would be an entire extra talk, for heaven's sake, because no, I'm very serious. The programming that was on the air on early stations ranged from awful to amazing. But one of the things that happened was, if you were a telegrapher, this is another place where hams were very valuable, because by the mid-20s, they are called hams and it becomes a good thing. In the 19-teens, it's an insult. But by the 1920s, yeah, if you want to do a baseball game, in many cases, you're going to recreate it because you don't have the money or the long lines, telephone, very expensive back then for long distance. So what you're going to do is you're going to send a telegrapher over to the game, and the telegrapher is going to like send you back what's happening, the play, and then you're going to recreate it using sound effects. And they did that for years. And I would wager that a whole bunch of people probably thought that, wow, they were really at the game. When in reality, they were sitting in a studio using crowd noise and using the crack of the bat and a whole bunch of, it was so cool. It was a whole art form. But yeah, I would be very happy if you ever wanted me to come back and do a whole conversation about what kinds of programs were on the air. Because as it turned out, there were some pretty groundbreaking programs. Early radio even did code practice, because you had to have an amateur there. You had to have somebody who knew Morse code in case the ships at sea were in trouble. So they actually had programs on the air in 1920, 21, 22, where they would teach you Morse code. Probably didn't sound that good, but no one had an expectation of anything different, okay? But one of my favorite stories about early radio was about the radio rabbi, Harry Levy. You've never heard of him, but every city had a rabbi or a priest or a minister who just embraced radio and used it not just for preaching, but for like inspirational messages and talking about current events. And Harry Levy became so popular in Boston radio that when they did a story about him in 1929 in the Boston Evening Transcript, and they went to his congregation to interview them, 20% of them weren't Jewish. They were people that had heard him on the radio, and they liked him, and they just decided to show up. And every city had one. So yeah, if you ever want me to come back, if I haven't bored you to tears and you would like me to come back and talk some more, I would be delighted, because there are a million stories about early radio, and I can tell many of them.
I got a comment. In the mid 1940s, I was going to church, and one of the persons there was a ham, and that's where I got interested in radio. But I took a tour through WLW radio stations in Cincinnati. And walked. I could hear the ball game thing going. Then I walked around the corner to an open door, and Wade Hoyt was there with the earphones on, talking and explaining what was happening on the game. Since he was in Cincinnati and the game was Chicago or somewhere else. That was surprised the hell out of me at that time.
Absolutely. Recreations become like the bread and butter of early radio, because like I said, you don't have the money or the long lines. AT&T was a monopoly, let's be honest, okay? Bell Telephone, and it cost an arm and a leg to get long lines to whatever city you were in so that you could listen to the game via telephone. Most stations couldn't afford it, and so they relied on recreations. And again, they also relied on live talent. Another thing, half the stuff online from the 1920s that claims to be original broadcasts, nah. Audio tape hasn't been invented, okay? What you had in 1929, they finally invent electrical transcriptions, but they're expensive. You have to get into a studio. They're huge. Yeah, they're on like big discs, and you got to go into a studio to get them done. So we've seen very few transcriptions until like about the mid 1930s, when some of the networks embraced them. But as far as early stations, everything's live. And I mean everything. But keep in mind, most stations are not on the air 24/7 in the 20s, okay? Your little Albuquerque station that was out in Las Cruces, 3 nights a week for 2 hours. That was it. And that was considered a big deal. And the audience was like, hearing voices and music, is there this much wonderfulness in the world? They weren't complaining. They had nothing to compare it to. So this is how it all started. And you helped to start it. You did. So do me a solid. See if you can find the names of any other forgotten amateurs from that period in the 20s and 30s. And let's tell their stories. And let's make sure the Albuquerque Radio Club is remembered. And let's make sure that those early days out in Las Cruces and at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque, these stations were a big deal in the 1920s. Very little is known about them. Maybe we can find out some more. Maybe there were more amateurs that worked there. But that's all I got for now. And I turned into a pumpkin in 10 minutes. So, no, actually, I've got to go meet with, just as I explained to Jerry, this was originally scheduled for an hour earlier. So I have students that I'm a professor. So I have students that I've got to talk to. So I've got time for maybe one more question.
Yeah. Donna, Rachel has a question.
Rachel.
Hello. Thank you. This is very informative and entertaining. You said that there was originally female broadcasters who were allowed into the business right at the very beginning. They were pioneers, so to speak. And
Absolutely.
then later on, when I started listening to the radio in the late 60s and 1970s, there was no such thing as a female announcer. So do you know what happened? When did females get pushed out of the industries?
This happened to Auntie Donna. I am the author, Rachel, of a book that you may find interesting. I've written 6 books, but you may find this one interesting. It's called Invisible Stars, A Social History of Women in American Broadcasting. Came out in 2014 in a 2nd edition, okay? Once upon a pond in a kingdom far away, there were a lot of women on the air. Now, agreed, some of them were in very stereotypical positions. There were also African-American broadcasters on the air in those early days. The earliest African-American broadcaster that I can find goes back to 1923, a guy by the name of Jack L. Cooper. The first Black sportscaster, 1929, Jocko Maxwell. So they were there right from the beginning. Ditto for women. Okay. And by the way, there were also Black engineers. I mean, it was a lot more multicultural than people give it credit for. Okay. But what there was in those early years was microphones. And the microphones distorted the female voice. And if you didn't have a big, deep voice to begin with, they made you sound like a chipmunk. So those carbon mics, those button mics you may have seen in pictures, okay? I believe I still have my presentation up, and I may even possibly have one. Let's see. Yeah, I do, because I'm so cute. Yes, these kinds of microphones, those little button microphones, those distorted the human voice horribly. They distorted the men too. Okay, which is how we got the custom of men with big, deep voices. The problem gets rectified with the next generation of microphones. But by then, it's already a custom that women don't sound good on the radio. And so it is that for a number of years, women are restricted to being singers, playing the piano, talking about cooking and recipes and stuff like that. And we don't really start seeing women getting the opportunity to be announcers till the 70s. I was the first woman in the history of Northeastern University, where I went to school, first woman to be on the air. Didn't happen until 1968. And after that, I could not get a radio job till 1973. So it was still uncommon, more based on custom than anything else, okay? There's no evidence, and there never has been, that women's voices by that time are a problem. Most of the guys couldn't have cared less as long as the program was interesting, but old habits die hard. Oh, by the way, one of the earliest African-American engineers we know about is a guy named Bill Gould, 1 NP, later 2 NP when he moved to Jersey. And he was the chief engineer of a commercial station. And he was also actively involved in amateur radio in Massachusetts, descendant of slaves, 3rd generation. Okay. So the bottom line is old customs, old habits, Rachel. My book gets into it in great detail. Invisible Stars, A Social History of Women in American Broadcasting. It's not just about women that were on the air. It's about changing attitudes towards women in the public sphere and the men who either embraced it or tried to prevent it. It's a very interesting book. I hope you'll check it out. Anything else I can tell you?
Donna, I got to tell you,
No, that's
I want to thank you so much for sharing with us your most valuable asset, which is your time. And you've been able to share some valuable information for us to have, which we are eternally grateful. Thank you for offering to come back and educate us on other things. And I will have
If you guys
Jerry-
want, if you do, let me know. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Mom didn't.
Not at
raise me.
all, not at all. I will have Jerry
No,
contact you in
great.
the future to go with that. Yul, did you have something else?
Well, I was going to throw in a little piece of trivia. Everybody's heard of a guy by the name of Smokey Robinson. What most people don't know is that before he was talked into writing music for Berry Gordy in Motown in Detroit, he was studying to become an electrical engineer to work at a radio station.
Absolutely.
And Donna probably knows that.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, there
Yeah.
were a number of musical performers as far back as the 20s who were also amateurs. Yeah, you betcha. It was
Yeah,
never
that's true.
as
Yeah.
like a, there's a wall, the truth is that there are so many stories to tell. There really are. And it's my privilege to tell them. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for your hospitality. And by the way, if you think of a question you want me to address, just shoot me an email. I'm pretty easy to find. dlh@donnahalper.com. Jerry knows how to get a hold of me. And I'll be happy to, and because if you're anything like me, you go to a talk and just when the speaker has to leave, you think of 5 questions that you wish you could have asked. So if that happens, let me know. Okay. Also, most public libraries, which are still a thing, probably have my books. Okay. Even Invisible Stars, the 2014 edition. Amazon has it at a very real, I've seen some, the early edition from 2001 at like $120 or something. But the more recent edition is available on retail, and it's based on what I've seen. They haven't changed the price. So if there's a particular person you want to know more about, or if there's anything else I can tell you, it would be my privilege. I can't thank you enough for your kindness.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Jerry, for bringing Donna here. You're a true champion. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again.
Well, that was pretty good, huh? And I don't know, I'm sure some of the guys in the High Desert Club don't recognize some of the folks that are on here, but I actually sent the link out to some of my friends in New Jersey. There's Charles Smolin. Hi, Charlie. How you doing?
Good. Thank you, Jerry.
I see you. And of course, I tried to advertise this